requirement to recover in year 2. Okay, so we don't fully recover. And so in this project, we would not be able to accept it, okay? So when we look at these questions, does the payback rule account for the time value of money? No, it does not, okay? There's no discounting at all in here, okay? Does the payback rule account for the risk of the cash flows? No, it does not, okay? And does the payback rule provide an indication about the increase in value? Okay, so you saw for that. Did the end result give you any sort of notion that there was value added? And so the answer here is no as well, okay? Should we consider the payback rule for our primary decision rule? Certainly not, okay? So it doesn't really do anything in terms of adding value to the firm or letting us know if this project, if we accept it, is adding value to our firm. So we have to go through sort of some advantages and disadvantages of payback and to understand exactly, those sort of things that we actually should be trying to base our decisions on, okay? So that brings us to discounted payback. Now, discounted payback is going to be a similar process to what we just looked at for payback, but those cash flows are actually discounted. So we're going to be computing the present value of each cash flow and then determine how long it takes to pay back on a discounted basis. So we're going to calculate the present values of those cash flows and apply that to our investment until we see what that payback is, okay? Compared to a specified required period. Again, the firm is going to specify we're only going to accept those projects that pay back our initial investment within a certain period of time. And so our decision rule is going to be to accept the project if it pays back on a discounted basis within the specified time, okay? So we're going to walk through sort of a scenario here too. And if you can notice here, these are the same cash flows that we had from our prior problem example, 165 minus 63, 120, but we're discounting it, okay? And we're subtracting that present value from our 165, okay? If we go back and we look at the prior problem for cash flow, then you can see that that is in itself there's still more to recover, okay, because we've not recovered as much as we had. So when we look at the discounted measure for year 2, okay, we still have $52,202 to recover. And then in year 3 is when we finally get our full investment back. Do we accept or reject the project? That's also still sort of the scenario that we want to understand. If our acceptance is, in our assumption here, was to accept those that pay back on a basis in 2 years, then the answer here for this one is no, okay? Because we didn't get a payback within 2 years. We got a payback within 2 and a fraction years, okay? Year 3 is when we got the full payback, okay? Hope this makes sense to you, okay? So does the discounted payback rule account for the time value of money? When we're looking at and comparing the actual discounted payback method, yes, this one does, okay? It does account because we did discount those cash flows. Does the discounted payback rule account for the risk of the cash flows? Not really, right? Just simply because there was an arbitrary cutoff date. So does the discounted payback rule provide an indication about increased value? And this answer is no as well. There's no there's no real way to measure what is the value of accepting the project. We do know one thing, and that is that it has at least given us a closer approximation of when we may get paid back based on the time value of money. So ultimately, should we consider the discounted payback, rule for our primary decision rule? No, again. Okay. So just wanting to walk you through some of the advantages again and disadvantages, okay, of discounted payback, so that you can see exactly how that is the case. Okay. Again, we're not going to be looking at any of this as far as accounting as well, so you don't have to worry about these, as well as discounts. We're not going to be looking at that, but we are going to be looking at internal rate of return, and understand that it is the most important alternative to NPV. Quite often it is used in practice and is intuitively appealing. It gives you a percent, right? NPV is a number, right? Where IRR is going to be a percent, okay? And we can sort of understand percents, okay? Especially if we have a required return of a certain percent. Percentages give us clarity on comparing projects, okay? And so while we'll learn more about internal rate of return, I always want to bring you back to net present value to let you know that net present value tends to trump internal rate of return most all the time, okay, as far as accepting or rejecting projects. So we'll see more about this in an example that we have going forward. But specifically, the definition of internal rate of return is that it's the return that makes the net present value equal to zero. Okay, so if you have a cash flow and a project investment, then those cash flows, the present value of those cash flows, whatever return it is that makes those net present values or the net present value equal to zero is the internal rate of return. Okay, so our decision rule again is to accept the project if the internal rate of return is greater than the required return. Remember, our required return, okay, we have to understand we're going to accept, okay, if the project internal rate of return is greater than the required return. So accept, okay, if R is greater than, if R is greater than R, okay? So moving forward, we're going to go through a calculating example of that, and we can use those same methods. Understand that it's almost impossible for you to calculate the internal rate of return. It's a very tedious process if you do not have a financial calculator. Okay, so we're going to enter the cash flows just like we did with NPV. Okay, but at the end, all we have to do is just press, in this case, we're going to press F and then IRR, okay, to solve for the internal rate of return. So our project that we already have in our calculator, okay, remember this net present value. So there's nothing else that you have to do. If you've solved the net present value, everything is in the calculator that we need to actually use. And in this case, all we have to do is press F and then IRR to get our internal rate of return of 16.13%. And in fact, this is what we actually solve for. Okay, so again, do we accept or reject the project? Because the internal rate of return 16.13 is greater than 12%, then yes, we accept. Okay, is that clear? Okay, we're going to skip slide 26, okay, just to show you and get to the decision criteria for the actual internal rate of return, so that you can actually see where that is as well. So specifically, does the internal rate of return rule account for the time value of money? Well, the answer to that is yes. Okay. Does the internal rate of return rule account for the risk of the cash flows? Yes. Okay. And does the internal rate of return rule provide an indication about the increase in value? Yes. It's going to give you a percent, right? And so your percent is going to be positive. It could be positive, it could be negative. Obviously, the percentage itself is going to be either above your required return or below your required return. So in that case, the answer is yes, okay? And should we consider the internal rate of return rule for our primary decision criteria? So in answer to that, okay, while it does provide value, okay, we could consider the internal rate of return rule as our primary decision criteria, but as we will see, sometimes you get conflicting answers with internal rate of return based on those cash flows. So I'm just going to say not necessarily, okay? All right, and you'll see why as we go forward. Obviously, there are some advantages, okay? We know the return. It's a number, it's a percent we can actually sink our teeth into. It is a simple way to communicate the value. Everybody understands percentages. If the internal rate of return is high enough, you may not need to estimate a required return, which is often a difficult task, okay? There's a Excel spreadsheet calculation there. Decision rule summary for each of these. Again, we're not going to focus on these, but obviously in this problem example, we did net present value set to accept, payback period set to reject, discounted period, payback period set to reject, and internal rate of return set to accept. Okay, so we have the primary one and sort of the secondary one saying to accept. So the decision rule should be to accept this project and move forward, okay? There are some rules between these two that we need to understand, and those exceptions, okay? NPV and IRR will generally give us the same decision, true, okay? But there are some exceptions. Non-conventional cash flows. So if you have a positive cash flow, negative cash flow, positive cash flow, negative cash flow. When you have cash flows like this, where you have multiple changes from positive and negative, that can, when the cash flow signs change more than once, that is a exception, okay? And it can actually give you multiple internal rate of returns. And so we have to look into that in more detail to determine whether or not IRR is giving us an indication to accept. And then we also have mutually exclusive projects. What is a mutually exclusive project? Initial investments are substantially different. In other words, issue of scale. Maybe they could you could do both of them if you had the budget for them. And then the timing of cash flows is substantially different. So there are things that we may want to consider further for mutually exclusive projects as well, okay? When we're looking at internal rate of return and non-conventional cash flows, when the cash flows, again, chain sign more than once, there is more than one IRR, as I said, okay? When you solve for the internal rate of return, solving for the root of an equation, and when you cross the x-axis more than once, there will be more than one return, okay, that solves the equation. So if we look forward to, obviously, if you have more than one internal rate of return, which one do you use to make the decision? You know, hopefully we can go through this example for non-conventional cash flows. Just let me tell you to start with, I'm telling you this to understand it, but we will not have a non-conventional cash flow problem on the exam. And so more than likely there will be an investment, okay, an initial CF sub 0 that is negative or considered to be an investment, and then everything else will be positive, okay? So well, I want you to walk through this and understand, this is what's happening. We have two instances where we have an internal rate of return, okay? Two internal rate of returns. And so which one do you accept in that case? If it's always difficult, okay? The NPV is positive at a required return of 15%, so you should accept. If you use the financial calculator, you would get an IRR of 10.11%, which would tell you to reject, okay? You need to recognize that there are non-conventional cash flows and look at the NPV profile. So again, we come back to net present value as the decision rule. Ultimately, that's what we're going to rely on mostly is the net present value, okay? You do have mutually exclusive projects, okay? If you choose one, you can't choose the other, okay? So you have to make a decision. I only have enough money to do one or the other. Which one do you choose? Okay, so in your analysis, you're going to compare NPV, okay, and IRR, and you go through those decision rules to understand which one you should actually accept, okay? Intuitively, you would use the following decision rules. NPV, choose the project with the higher NPV. And for internal rate of return, choose the project with the higher internal rate of return, okay? So this is an example with mutually exclusive projects, Project A and Project B. And these are cash flows, okay, for A, cash flows for B, okay? And we have an internal rate of return for A of 19.43, and we have an internal rate of return of 22.17 for Project B, okay? The question is, which one should we accept? Obviously, the Project B's internal rate of return is more, okay? But net present value is more on Project A, okay? So ultimately, when you have conflicting scenarios like this, you should always result and choose the one with a positive NPV, okay? I think that that's something that you'll actually grow to learn, okay? So always use NPV. Whenever there's a conflict, NPV directly measures the increase in value to the firm, so always use NPV whenever there's a conflict. IRR is unreliable in the following situations: non-conventional cash flows and mutually exclusive projects. So I'll do a different video for modified internal rate of return so that you can see the difference there, but that's a little more involved. And so I hope this has helped you.